Hello, folks. Refugees. It's a topic all the rage, making it into CNN, ABC News, Daily Maverick, and of course, once again, the legacy media reporting things to create a political perspective rather than being objective. All of these stories include facts and even some genuine analysis, but all of them obsess about white trying to promote racism and racial discord. All three of them. I'm not going to focus on the Daily Maverick story because it spends most of its time talking about immigrants to America, people who aren't actually immigrants. They're asylum seekers and refugees. Those aren't immigrants. Those are people here, in theory, on a temporary basis. But I am going to talk about the CNN article, which says 18 months later, the U.S. has admitted more than 7,700 Afrikaners, but the effort has hit some notable bumps along the way. Now, first off, I'm going to comment about this because it shows you just how lazy these people are. I've noticed in all these stories that I'm referring to today, references, but particularly in the CNN story, references to analysis that I've done before anyone else has done the analysis. And they're simply taking my analysis and they're using the information, but not attributing it. Also, they're using dated information. The number is not 7,700 South Africans. They're not Afrikaners, first off. It's not 7,700 Afrikaners. It's over 8,000 South Africans. You see, they neglected to include the 335 who came in fiscal year 25 from May 12th to September 30th. Actually, September 26th. The last flights went out around then. So the number is actually over 8,000. And it's not 8,000 Afrikaners, but in order to achieve their goal of racial division and hatred of white people, they call them all Afrikaners. Now, inside this story, they actually reference someone, Beth Oppenheim, who is correct about what she says, and I'll read what she had to say. It's clear to us that the designation of one population over literally all others does not represent the actual humanitarian need. Beth Oppenheim, president and CEO of HIAS, that's a Hebrew refugee agency, that is part of an ongoing lawsuit challenging the administration's suspension of the refugee program. Of course, that's a dog whistle. When she says one population, she's talking about white Afrikaners, which is not accurate. It's not true. But her point that one country designation over others does not present actual humanitarian need. Fair point. She said it doesn't mean there aren't white South Africans who deserve protection. Of course there are. But when you say they're the only one population that needs protection, that doesn't reflect the reality in our world. Well, once again, she's factually wrong. This shows you the racism and bigotry of Hebrew services against South Africans. First off, they aren't all white South Africans. And white South Africans aren't Afrikaners. Some are, but not all are. She noted that the program for refugees in America has historically been reserved for some of the world's most vulnerable populations who have already fled their home countries and are often living in refugee camps. True. But she didn't note that we have no obligation to take any of those people. But she's correct about that. That is often how it's been done. Trump's move to narrow the U.S. refugee program to include only Afrikaners stunned career officials in the early days of the administration, prompting discussions over who exactly would be eligible to enter the United States and whether they needed to be white or other minorities in South Africa would be eligible. So Trump's effort to narrow the program to Afrikaners, that's actually a true statement. What they're saying is accurate there. And if you go back to February 7th of 2025, I said in that first broadcast, just 2 hours after Trump executive order, that I hoped to include ethnic minorities. And by that, of course, I meant racial minorities. And I said that throughout that long weekend, that Friday, the Saturday, the Sunday, and when the information came out on the U.S. Embassy website on the Monday, the 10th of February, it said racial minorities. They carved out this group out of nowhere, one of the sources for CNN said. That's why there was a back and forth that took place. Officials landed on a broad definition that doesn't specify race and notes that to be eligible for consideration, individuals must be of South African nationality, must be of Afrikaner ethnicity, or be a member of a racial minority in South Africa, among other requirements. Those overwhelming majority who've come here to the U.S. are white South Africans. Now, all of that is true. Where was that at with Donnie O'Sullivan in that hit job, that fake documentary that CNN produced about attacking Trump on the eve of the G20 summit? Where was this truth then? Where is Donnie O'Sullivan to correct the record for the lies he was spreading? Or for that matter, Ronald Lamola? What is stated there is factual. Officials landed on a broad definition that doesn't specify race and notes that to be eligible for consideration, individuals must be South African nationality, must be Afrikaner ethnicity, or be a member of a racial minority in South Africa. That's 100% correct. Where has this admission been for nearly 18 months? I have been reporting this from the outset. I've been analyzing it and got it 100% correct. Now CNN is admitting that. But they still term this whites. But it's not just whites. Now, they say some Afrikaners arrive in the United States in a matter of weeks. That's factually incorrect. Who's arriving here in weeks? I've interviewed over 60 South African families. Not one of them came here in weeks. In fact, the shortest time that anyone came over here was, I think, 5 or 6 months. Most 8 to 12 to 15 months. So where are these people coming in a matter of weeks? And it says others are being denied over issues with criminal history, and denial rates are hovering in the teens, higher than the single-digit percentages that are typical for other refugee programs, sources told CNN. Well, I'd like to know who these sources are. I've actually talked to people who've gotten the letters, and I also have sources. And my sources, that's poppycock, denial rates in the teens. That's utter. First off, there are no denials. They're ineligibility. So CNN doesn't even get the terminology right. So they're talking to sources in the government and using the wrong terminology. Sources in the government would tell them that these are ineligibility. Either they ignored that and chose to pick the term they prefer, denial rates, or they're gaslighting us here, hovering in the teens. Really, my estimation was 500 to 1,000. I said roughly 500 to 800, but the media's been reported as 1,000. And I'll stick by the number based on my actual polling on the day the letters went out, the first letters on June 30th, and those have contacted me. My estimation based on that data is 500 to 1,000. And I'm hovering between 500 and 800 is where I really think it's at. That's not in the teens, right? We know, for instance, that Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, testified in committee last year, unclassified, before the cameras, when asked the question about how many South Africans, I think they said Afrikaners, have applied for this program. And that time, all we had was a statement of interest, which came out on the 12th of May, and this was around the 26th of May, somewhere around that. And in committee, he told members of Congress that over 72,000 people had already applied in just those 2 weeks. So if 500 letters went out and there were 72,000 applications in 2 weeks last year, never mind all the time that's expired since the end of May, the rest of the year, the other 7 months, plus these 7 months this year, 14 months since then, it seems implausible that nobody else applied. I know that's not true because I meet people every day that come on my channel asking how to apply and then tell me they've applied. So to claim that these were in the teens is BS. It doesn't pass the common sense test. And I don't know who CNN sources are, but I question their authenticity. What you'd have is a case of an individual who suffered 3 or 4 incidents that involve criminality, sometimes even violent crime. But the question was, what indication was there that this was on account of a protected ground? Well, that's a fair point. And that's what I told people from the very beginning. You had a lot of South Africans who would write to me, well, I've been a victim of crime. This happened to me. We were assaulted. Spouse was raped. My parents were murdered. That's all tragic, but none of that is grounds for coming to the United States. That doesn't make you a refugee. Being a victim of crime or discrimination does not make you a refugee. Being persecuted does. If the attack was based on your skin color, then it's persecution. But CNN isn't explaining that. I am. They say the program caused tensions on the ground late last year when South African government briefly held, then released 2 U.S. government employees on assignment in South Africa. U.S. officials have since moved their operations to a diplomatic site where temporary structures have also stood up for processing. That's what the sources said. Well, we don't need sources. We can read News 24. It's actually happened. Now, the State Department spokesperson told CNN this is not a mere diplomatic spat. The South African government raided the processing center and doxed and harassed American officials in an attempt to delegitimize the plight of Afrikaners and intimidate those at the processing center. Correct. In violation of the Vienna Convention, international norms, while claiming they're a sovereign state and violating our sovereignty. While there have been exceptions, processing refugees in their own country, in-country refugee, as is happening in South Africa, is unusual, as I've told you. And this is according to their experts, because they're residing in a place that they're claiming to be persecuted. Typically, the situation is so urgent and dangerous that people are forced to flee their homes to another country. Yeah, except that's not really true. That's not really true. In-country refugee status, we've done for Bosnia. It wasn't so urgent. We've done it for Cuba. It's not that urgent. You people are being persecuted there, yet they're allowed to come over here. So that's a misrepresentation. If what they're trying to say is typically refugees have fled to another country, that's true. But that's not what they're implying here. Now, they say experts who spoke with CNN stressed that there may be individual cases that fit the criteria for refugee status, but overwhelmingly, they said, Afrikaner cases are based on discrimination, which is short of what's required by U.S. international law to qualify as a refugee. Now, notice how CNN changes the narrative. They were talking to sources within the government. Now they're talking to experts. Who are these experts? Who are they? Are they like the immigration advisor who makes money sending people to Canada, who said that being a refugee is a black mark in your passport? Remember that clown? Who are these experts? And by the way, how do these experts know that the overwhelming majority of these cases are based on discrimination? How do they know that? Have they read the case files? Have they interviewed the refugees who come over here or those who haven't come over here? No, they haven't. So these experts are offering an uninformed opinion. I, on the other hand, have talked to thousands of these people, thousands of them in South Africa last year, at my meet and greets, all over America, at over 30 plus meet and greets in a dozen states. Black, white, and brown South Africans. I've actually talked to these people. I've heard their stories. Now, people may be lying to me. People may be embellishing, but that's a different story. But I'll stack my expertise up against CNN's so-called experts. Of course, this is the network that used Donnie O'Sullivan to lie about President Trump. And when I told him the truth about it, well, the facts obscure their objective and their narrative. How do these experts know that these are overwhelming cases of discrimination? That's poppycock. Now, the most striking difference in the U.S. refugee program is it was dominated by people who met the international definition of refugee, and none of these are, said a refugee advocate. Now, refugee advocates, of course, are the people who are suing the Trump administration because they've lost $9 billion a year in revenue, and they've had to make people redundant. So they are far from objective. Also, once again, this refugee advocate who talked to CNN, what do they know about these cases? They don't know anything. These are opinions. That is not news. If you report on this, you have to give the context of this advocate. Who's the advocate? And why are they unnamed if they're an advocate? Sources, yes. Inside the government. Sources, you don't name them. Got it. But this advocate? Who's the advocate? You're just making this crap up, CNN. Sudden obsession with refugees. And once again, of course, Daily Maverick puts them in quotation marks, refugees. And we see ABC News saying that they're white. These are all lies and misleading statements intended to bifurcate society and cause racial discord. But we don't fall for their nonsense. We don't fall for their nonsense. CNN has taken facts, mixed it with opinion, and presented it as news. They cite experts who they don't name, talking about advocates who have a dog in the fight, who have lost $9 billion a year in revenue, roughly, because they're not processing 100,000 people flooding into our country. Make no mistake, these agencies are not humanitarian. They're money machines. They're jobs programs. And they're meant to pretend to do goodwill while flooding this country with people. And because we're no longer flooding this country with people that they prefer, who aren't white, who aren't Christian, who won't assimilate, somehow it's wrong. Persecution is persecution, folks. People around the world can be persecuted, unfortunately. And if the person being persecuted doesn't fit your predetermined view of what a person being persecuted is, doesn't make them illegitimate, doesn't mean they're not persecuted, and doesn't mean they're not a refugee. Shame on CNN. An improvement, much better this time. But how about talking to people who actually know what they're talking about, CNN? And this story is no different. It's better, it's an improvement, but it's still a narrative. And it's a dishonest narrative, trying to diminish the suffering of white South Africans by neglecting and ignoring the plight of black, Indian, and colored South Africans who've come to America. Completely ignoring them. Not mentioned once. Not a single mention that non-Afrikaner whites are here, that black South Africans are here, that Indians are here, or that colors are here. All they say is that there was a discussion about who would be included. But then they don't elaborate on that. But hey, legacy media, billions of dollars. Do what they want. Yeah. What say you, South Africa, Mzansi? U.S., what do you have to say about this? Cheers.